Hey, MBA hopefuls, we are on the air with MBA Waves, your weekly broadcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Today on episode 121, we have some interesting news about diversity, and we are going to get into just what business schools mean by diversity, why diversity is so important to business schools, and just how you can leverage your own diverse profile, even for some scholarships. I'm your host for today, Eric Lucrezia, joined by my co-host, Barra Sapir. How you doing, Barra?
I'm good. It's good to see you, Eric.
Good to see
Good
you.
to see our guests, too.
We're going to introduce them in just 1 second. And don't forget, if you like this week's episode, don't forget to give us a little thumbs up and subscribe to MBA Waves on our YouTube channel to stay on top of all the great free tips to help you get into business school. So on today's episode 121, we're talking about diversity and the MBA experience. We have two guests from Management Leadership for Tomorrow, also known as MLT. I want to introduce both Shannon, Reinard, Demko, and Lance Bennett. How you doing, guys?
Doing really well. Thanks for having us today.
Hello. Great to be here.
Welcome to the show. So we're going to just jump right into it. Speaking about diversity in the context of MBAs, let's take it back. So, organizations and businesses, they need diverse teams, and diversity does go beyond race, color, culture, nationality, age, and so much more. So that said, how do you guys think, and either one of you wants to take this, how do you guys think diversity brings more balance to the world?
I'm actually going to let Lance take that first, and then I'll follow up, because Lance does, in addition to working with MLT, does a bit of diversity consulting work on his own and has a vast array of expertise.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. I'll jump in. So as Shannon mentioned, I am the founder of LEB Partners, and we are a organization that focuses on equity and inclusion and lead a lot of equity and inclusion trainings and workshops. So this question about how does diversity add balance to the world, I think is really broad, number one. But let me talk about it from this perspective. When you think about all of the difference that we have in the world, being able to share that and being able to experience some of that difference actually brings a lot of value to individuals. So I thought about this from a technological perspective, right? There was a time where I may not know what is happening in Asia or what's happening in Africa or what's happening in some other part of the world. But now being able to understand and get that information, understand what those different cultural experiences are like, getting an opportunity to understand like how to make a particular meal that might be very different from what I may have had before, right? It brings some balance. So it doesn't make my experience, it makes it a lot less homogenous when I can think about access to lots of different people, lots of different experiences. So I think it brings balance to the world from that perspective, certainly from a business school perspective and an industry perspective, understanding that there are different ways to do things and getting the opportunity to share that, not only how I might do this or how our organization may do this, but how other organizations do it, brings a lot of a balance in all aspects.
100%. I mean, just to respond to what you're saying, the internet has just been a game changer, right? I think there's no more excuse for ignorance, just curiosity. You can learn so much about other cultures. I think it's also interesting to not have that, I think they call it the single story problem, where people base their impressions of an entire segment of a demographic, let's say, on their experience with one person. Mm-hmm. And so it's an opportunity to interact and have a more complete picture and not just have a stereotype become the impression. Shannon, what did you want to add to that?
Well, I also think, as a complement to everything Lance shared, that there's an incredible business case for diversity as well. And I have bookmarked for years a Harvard Business Review article called Why Diverse Teams Are Smarter, which cites a number of different research studies that tell you how diversity on teams directly impacts the bottom line, directly impacts outcomes, directly impacts the ability of a team and an organization to innovate. I mean, it's having a variety of ideas. And this is where I want to add that it's not just about diversity, it's also about inclusion. It's not just about having a variety of perspectives represented in a conversation, but also the capacity for the team to to listen, to incorporate, to integrate those different ideas. When those two things can happen together, that's where you truly see progress. And that's the whole point of pursuing an MBA, is to be a part of that movement forward for whatever your industry of interest is.
It's like going way beyond tokenism, like, oh, we don't just have representation, but actually we're listening and exchanging and incorporating ideas from different backgrounds. Awesome. Yeah, totally. Barra, did you want to?
Well, I'm just, I just had this flash, which I hadn't had when we were planning this episode, which was that when I was a TA at Michigan, a teaching assistant at Michigan, we did an exercise, the first training that we had, where people stood on one side of the room and they said they would talk about all of these different experiences that different people had that you might not talk about in regular conversation. Like, how many of you have both parents? How many of you are identified as Jewish? How many of you are identified as, and you would walk across the other side of the room. And then you saw that by the end of the exercise, everyone had gone back and forth. And so that tokenism that you're talking about, or that sort of like identifying, it's just interesting. Like, we've come this far because it's been decades now since we did that exercise. And I'm just realizing that that was my, I think, beginning of really understanding diversity training, like my understanding of, we all have our own unique experiences, and some of them are seen and some of them aren't. Right. And some of that was, they wanted us as teaching assistants to really create that inclusion that you're talking about, Shannon. So I'm just reminiscing about that. Like, I just had that flash. But you mentioned something really important, I think, and I'd love you to talk a little bit more, Shannon, about how does diversity actually impact those academic and professional realms? Like, you talked about the bottom line and you talked about this Harvard study, but what are you seeing both in the students that you're working with at MLT, but also just what's the research saying?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is that, I mean, the whole point of going to business school is to expand your worldview, or one of the primary points, right? And no matter who you are, no matter what kind of experience you've had growing up and where you've grown up, there are certain things that you sort of take for granted as being normal ways of doing things. And that applies to business too. Even if you're working for a large corporation in a particular part of the world, even if that's a global corporation with offices in other parts of the world, the way that business is done on your team, the way that business is done in your office or in your regional hub or whatever it may be, might be dramatically different than some of the norms you take for granted in other parts of the world. And I think that's one of the great benefits of coming to a world-class business school. And there are many, many, many world-class business schools. We're very lucky in our space to be able to say that, is to encounter those norms and to begin to question things that you have simply done kind of in a rote manner, that this is how we interact. This is what we do first, and then second, and then third. This is how we organize ourselves in the room. This is how we introduce ourselves. This is how a meeting flows. This is what the priority for a meeting is. These are things you learn even outside of the classroom in your team-based learning environment when you have a group project that you need to do. And that's the point of all of it, I think, is to begin to question everything you think you know about first how business is done, and then in the best possible setting. And this is where the other side of me, the mindfulness piece, starts coming in, but just questioning what you yourself take for granted about what's important and what you're doing here in this endeavor, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add a little bit to that, because before MLT, I was actually the director of diversity admissions at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. And one of the things that we knew was the importance of building a very diverse class was, just as Shannon said, to be able to bring all these different perspectives into the room. And I know you specifically mentioned academia. Faculty, as great as the faculty are at all of our partner business schools, they still have a limited perspective, right? They can't be in all places at all times. And so the learning really takes place from the students and them being able to share their different perspectives, their different experiences in business, along with the technical information that they're receiving from the faculty. And that's where the learning really takes place. So, I think it's really important to build the most diverse class you can. The other thing that I think about is business schools are building leaders, right? And these leaders are going to manage multiple people. They're also going to have multiple functions that they may be responsible for. And so I think it is not just important to be technically competent, that you get the information, but to also be culturally competent. Because if you're culturally competent, then you start sort of separating yourself from other leaders, because you can understand the experiences of many that may be on your teams. That may be very different from others who may not have had that, or may have had a more homogenous experience in their professional life. So business school can be a great game changer for leaders to, again, not only understand how to manage the technical piece of the business, but also to manage the cultural piece of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Companies have understood for decades now, study after study has shown that diversity improves the results of the company, improves profit lines, improves everything. I mean, you have multiple perspectives that are different ways of solving problems, different questions that are asked, that we should consider this or that to avoid issues, to avoid loss, and so forth. So I think business schools are kind of like gatekeepers to the corporate world, right? There's a certain level of trust that is given to these business schools that companies know they are taking in not only people who are great and bright and motivated, but also the right mix of people that's going to shape them to be even better leaders, to answer some of those difficult questions and to make those tough decisions. And so I know a lot of decisions are often affected by factors of diversity. What do you guys think are some ways of overcoming biases and judgments?
So you want me to jump in on this one, Shannon?
I do. I do.
I saw your face, so I was like, yeah, she's ready for me to do this.
He can lead
you. So there are multiple ways to sort of overcome biases and stereotypes that we may have about difference. And I think the very first way to do that is to acknowledge that we have them. Oftentimes, we want to see ourselves as good people. And so we don't want to acknowledge that we may have some beliefs or some messaging. In many cases, it's messaging about difference. And that messaging may not always be positive, right? So I think the first thing to do is acknowledge that. The second is we have to give ourselves some grace, because the messages that we have about difference often don't come from our actual experience with different people. Some of those messages come from what we've heard from others. And many times those messages come from people who look like us, right? Who haven't also had the actual experience with certain groups. So I like to say, I have years of messaging about difference that is not actually accurate, because now as I've had the...
Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute now.
Right. I thought I heard an echo, so I tried to unplug. But what I was saying is the messages that I had received about difference, I realized that a lot of that is not accurate. And that comes from my own personal experience now engaging across difference. So it is, I think, again, the key is acknowledging that we have the difference or have the bias, giving ourselves some grace about where the messaging may come from, and then start engaging across difference, and not just across difference, but about the difference, so that we can sort of change our own messaging and we have our own ideas of what a different identity group is, for us. So I think that's one of those ways that we can start overcoming some of those.
Shannon, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that makes the MBA experience so special as a graduate endeavor is the amount of personal work that it allows space for, right? So because the ultimate goal is leadership, of some kind or another in some space or another, it's required that you do work and are pushed to do work that forces you to look inward. And again, like, here we go, me and my mindful MBA stuff. But like, this is ultimately about your willingness to tolerate discomfort, your coachability, your willingness to look at your assumptions, at your wiring, again, to use the phrase from before, the things you take for granted. And as Lance said, it's about first being willing to acknowledge that you have biases and that it doesn't make you a bad person because you have them. It doesn't make you problematic. We all grew up somewhere in some kind of community, and we're told certain things about ourselves and others, and sometimes different kinds of others. And it's really normal to have a worldview based on that, to have the opportunity to step into MBA study and kind of expand that worldview and start to question it is extraordinary. And it requires that you are willing to take apart what you think you already know. And that is ultimately how we shape someone who doesn't just become a better leader over the course of 10 months or 1 year or 2 years or however long they're in school, but continues, is equipped with the skills to continue to do that through the duration of their career. And therefore, and then as they evolve in leadership, to kind of inspire and encourage others to do the same throughout.
Yeah, I love what you're both saying just about it sounds to me like there's this curiosity, right? That we're always on. We're not just surfing on and just kind of asleep at the wheel, because some of the things that you were talking about, Lance, like the things that other people have said or the things that they haven't even experienced, it's like it's around us all the time, whatever culture we're in, right? If you go to another country where the dominant culture is something, you go there, all of a sudden that's the norm, right? And it's when you take yourself out of that, either by going someplace completely different or by going to business school where there's so many different factors, or any kind of school, any kind of program, any kind of workshop, right? Like that invites that kind of curiosity. We find that I always find that the more we express our uniqueness, the more we realize how much we're the same, right? So that I think comes down to it. We all want a lot of the same things. So one of the things that Eric, that you brought up was this idea that diversity makes things just so dynamic, right? And makes it really interesting. And I know that diversity fosters innovation like nothing else, right? It's innovation of the self, innovation outside of the self. How do we use it to help MBA students adopt leadership styles that embrace it? How do we fuel that curiosity?
I feel like it sort of begins where we left off with the last question, is by helping them to increase their tolerance for discomfort, and then their ability to operate with discernment and with intention in that space, right? So the capacity for a leader to be in potentially a very public facing role, either within their organization or just generally, and to, for example, make a mistake, to say something that implies something they didn't intend for it to imply, to use a word they didn't fully understand, for example, and to face whatever the results of that might be in a public way. The necessary trait there is to be someone to say, oh, I didn't realize. What can I now do from here to help myself learn, to help repair whatever damage may have been done, to move forward from here? And that, the capacity for that, can very much be either learned or enhanced in business school, depending on what one comes in with already, right? There's so much opportunity to say, I've never heard that before. This is entirely new to me. Tell me more about it. It seems like you have a lot of experience with this. Would you be willing to share with me more about it? And just to come from a place of, I'm not sure and I don't know. There's a certain absence of ego there that we don't normally associate with the business world. But if you truly have chosen an MBA program where you feel safe expressing yourself and acknowledging what you don't know. That's, by the way, how you know you're in the right place. You're actually going to learn through the experience. But that in and of itself is a leadership quality. So I think that's the start of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
I was just gonna add to that. If you come in actually being excited about changing, right? So that you can come into this business school experience with, okay, I know a certain amount of things. Here's what I want to learn. I know the school can teach me these things, but I think students should come in excited about what I don't know, as Shannon just mentioned. And so being open to learning from their peers. It's a great opportunity because in many cases, in all cases in business school, none of the students have title, right? So you can't come in and say, oh, well, I used to run this here. Well, you don't run that when you're in business school. Everybody is at the same level, which gives you an opportunity to be more of a learner than necessarily a leader then. And so then you can take that. And I think part of the question was about being innovative and creative. You learn from others, and that gives you the opportunity to be more innovative in your leadership style when you leave business school. But you have to be open to hearing the experiences of others, appreciating them, and then being able to incorporate those into your already great leadership style coming in.
The word humility is coming up for me.
Exactly.
Right? Like, it's interesting because we had the word grace that we talked about before, curiosity, humility, excitement. Like, these are all they're just great dynamic words that really sculpt what possibilities there are for students.
Lance, to your point, I mean, first of all, if you're starting an MBA program and you're not rip-roaring excited about this, like you fought tooth and nail to get that GMAT score, right? You've been busting your butt for months. You did the interview, you got in. I mean, you must be if you're not excited, you're at the wrong school. Hands down. Like, that's my opinion anyway. Looks like Shannon agrees. And then Bara, you hit it on the head with humility. I would say what you guys are talking about, all of you are talking about, is emotional intelligence. And that is definitely one of the key traits that I think any top business school is looking for in their students. They want to make sure that their starting point, their baseline is a high level of EQ. And then it's just about building on that from there. And you were speaking about diversity awareness, diversity training. I would say it's almost like self-awareness training. Like it's the more self-aware you are, like, who are you? What's your starting point? What are your triggers? And that gives you, I guess, perspective on who might be in front of you, and taking a step back and say, hey, maybe this person is acting this way for a reason that I don't understand yet. And I think that is a valuable lesson.
To your point, Eric.
Yeah,
that is literally where I start when we start thinking about diversity training.
Okay.
It's all internal work first.
Yeah.
Before you can do anything externally to build inclusive environments, you have to do your own work first. And you have to understand who you are, the identity groups that you're a part of, how you show up, how that might look for other people, understanding what that looks like even before you can actually start doing things for others. So what you're saying is, I am confirming what you're saying is exactly right. It's the internal work first that produces a more equitable experience externally.
I mean, as an admissions consultant and a coach, I'm getting that's what you guys do as well. I mean, like, you end up being a bit of a shrink. There's a bit of psychology going into that, going internally, as you said, as a starting point, and then you could build from there. Speaking of what you guys do, tell us a little bit more about MLT, Management Leadership for Tomorrow. I did a little bit of research on it. It's been around for a couple of decades at this point, right? And how does MLT support business school applicants?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be delighted. And Lance, please feel free to jump in as well. Lance and I have both benefited from working now within MLT for several years. I've been with MLT for just over 10 years. Lance, I think, is in your third year now with us. But we both worked with MLT when we worked at business schools. I was at Emory Gazweta Business School, and Lance at Kellogg and Wake Forest before that as partners of MLT. So we've been on both sides of the work. Management Leadership for Tomorrow, MLT, has been around for a little over 2 decades now. we exist to advance racial equity. We are a racial equity organization. MLT's work, essentially at this point, it has grown significantly over the past 2 decades. And essentially MLT's work at this point exists in the way I think of it in 2 spaces. One is coaching programs, where we work directly with individuals, depending on where they are at their education and career trajectory, either supporting them through getting internships and full-time placement, either through undergrad or MBA, or then we have coaching programs that move through the senior leadership trajectory. And on the other side, we have advisory services, where we work directly with organizations through programs like our Racial Equity at Work certification, where an organization can really explore not just broadening the diversity of their talent pipeline, for example, but really looking at some of their internal practices and how diversity is supported or not within those. So that's where we go from the person being willing to do the internal work to the organization being willing to look inward. But on our side, Lance and I work with MBA Prep. I'm the senior director of the program, and I manage our business school partnerships, and Lance is a senior coach in our DEI lead. MBA Prep, we joke sometimes that we are both the oldest child and the middle child in MLT's coaching programs. When MLT was founded, it was just MBA Prep. And these other coaching programs have emerged on both sides of us from a timeline perspective, working with undergrads and then senior leaders on the other side. In MBA Prep, we work with top talent, diverse young professionals, specifically those who self-identify as Black, African American, Latinx, Latin, or Native Indigenous Americans. In our program, all of our participants self-identify in some way with one of those identities. They are also U.S. citizens, permanent residents, DACA recipients, or TPS, temporary protected status recipients. Our program begins in March every year, and we have 2 formats. One is traditional MBA Prep, and the other is an accelerated version. And I can address that more in a minute, but we work with our fellows, as we call individuals in MBA Prep, through every aspect of their application, same as you may do each on your own side as well, from working the introspective work, the personal story building, the goal articulation through things like essays and interview prep, career research, school research, testing support and enhancement, and things like that. We also have 35 partner business schools in the US and also in the UK that we work with. And our program participants, our fellows, have the opportunity to engage directly with those schools in some of our in-person seminars that we host throughout the summer on the campuses of some of our partner business schools. Fellows come together, meet reps from all the schools, and get the opportunity to start practicing some of what they're learning in MBA Prep. The last thing I'll say is that I mentioned the program starts in March each year, but the application is actually open already. The deadline is January 10th for those who want to begin our program next March. If you begin the program in March 2024, you will apply to business school in fall 2024 to enroll in business school in fall 2025. So it's for the planners out there. If you happen to miss that timeline, I alluded to the accelerated program already. Accelerated is a program track you can choose to join from March right away, but we also kind of leave the door open a little bit. So if you miss the deadline and sometime around April, May, June, July, you'd like to join MBA Prep, you have the opportunity to do that through the accelerated program. And I'm happy to share more about that as well. But that's MLT's life story and MBA Prep's in a nutshell. Lance, did I miss anything?
Oh, wow. No, you did not. That was awesome. The only thing I'll add to that is as one of the senior coaches on the team, the coaches, we are all really committed to the work that we do. We've all had experience working in business school and in graduate business admissions prior to MLT, but we all are very much in support of this mission and very much in support of our fellows. That commitment, I think, shows not just in the great curriculum that we take them through from March to March, but in the amount of time that each coach spends with their fellows, getting to know them, helping them with all the different aspects of their application, as Shannon mentioned. And then I think one of the things that is really I think cool about this whole program and the curriculum is something that actually Shannon built on around well-being. So it is not just about, oh, how do you build a great application? But as we're going through this process, we're also asking them to be introspective about who they are and taking care of themselves in this process, because it is a very difficult process. Applying to business school probably sounds pretty easy, but it is challenging work. And so helping our fellows take care of themselves and think about others in this process as well, I think makes our program a little bit unique. And so, I'm just continue to be excited about working with the program and working with the fellows.
I'm glad you guys are around doing this work. It's really important.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I know on your website, I'm just going to jump into this. On your website, it talks about the big disagreement you have with the SCOTUS decision, right? And then you have a statement, which is, understandable. Can you talk a little bit about that and about how it's affecting your work with students and the application process?
So for the broader audience, it's not in the U.S. SCOTUS stands for the Supreme Court of the United States. Hi, France. And this summer, it was a landmark decision that overturned the previous decision, which goes back to the 70s, I believe, when schools had the right to use race, among other factors, as a criteria in the admissions decision process. And if I'm saying this wrong in legalese, please tell me. And so this was under, we can even say, Trump's court. This went through a revision, which for many people is taking a step backwards. Not everyone agrees, but this is what the conversation is. So please take it away, MLT.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for raising the question. It's certainly top of mind for so many people in our space right now. And thanks for doing the research and seeing our CEO, John Rice's statement on the ruling after it came through this summer. We do take the stance that we disagree with the ruling, like many of our partner institutions and other organizations also stated out loud as well, which we appreciated seeing. So in terms of our stance and our CEO and our board got together and everyone agreed that we are a nonprofit organization in the US. We are therefore able to continue doing the work we do as we do it. The Supreme Court decision, or SCOTUS, as we're saying, directly impacts the admissions process of colleges and universities in the United States. And explicitly says that they are not to make race a deciding factor in an admissions decision as it is made. So knowing that this was coming, we prepared, we did lots of research to understand what may or may not happen as the ruling came down. And we were really fortunate. If there are silver linings to things like this, I don't know. It happened during the summer when we are fully engaged with our business school partners in person at our seminars. So we're able to convene and just sort of express our thoughts. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of uncertainty at that point as the ruling came through about how schools might interpret it. And really where things go once the ruling comes through is each university's legal counsel sits down and interprets it and determines how it may or may not impact the policies and protocol of that school's admissions processes. And we're here talking about MBA programs, which exist within business schools. But here in the US, at least, most of these business schools exist under the umbrella of a larger university, sometimes even a state university system. And so it's not just what are we going to do with our application, but what are the lawyers for our entire system telling us to do? What is being mandated for us. And we're very fortunate that our partner schools stayed engaged with us throughout and really relied on us as a thought partner to help them think through what changes what information they were receiving from their counsel and what changes might be necessary in terms of their work. We are also fortunate. So we're able to continue our work as MBA Prep. We're working with our fellows business as usual. In terms of our work with schools, we do have these wonderful kind of conversational partnerships with them, but we are a recruiting partner for them. We bring in fellows that we choose, that we decide to work with in the manner we work with them, and provide our business school partners the opportunity to meet these fellows at our events. And so our work doesn't directly impact the admissions process. We are not there for the decision. We don't know anything about the decision. The decision is entirely up to the schools. And so thus far, we are able to continue our work with our school partners as well. What we have deeply appreciated is the reinforcement of their commitment to their partnership with us and their appreciation for us as a recruiting partner, as many of them turn to simply broaden their applicant pool in general, right? We've been talking about diversity in a broad sense on this conversation so far. And I think that's how we have to continue to think about it, is that whenever a restriction is put in one place in a process, where can there be some ease, some expansion created in another part of it? And our business schools that we work with have been recruiting the world over this fall more than ever in an effort to meet as many different kinds of applicants as possible and keep their classes as diverse as possible. Because again, circling back to the beginning of our conversation, we know that this truly, truly matters. So it was a disappointing decision. It did, I think, for MLT feel like a step backwards to the important work that we're doing. But thus far, we are able to continue doing the good work that we want to. And we are really grateful to be in partnership with as many folks such as you and business schools and other organizations who are committed to diversity in a broad sense in higher education learning environments.
I don't have anything to add to that. That is thanks, Shannon, for sharing that. That is awesome. Yes.
Very complete response. Thank you, Shannon. So, with the students you work with, I wanted to talk about some scholarship potential, right? I mean, I always tell people, if you're ever wondering if business schools truly care about diversity, just look at the scholarship offer. So there is a lot of money that is to encourage a diverse class. So how would you guys say, how does diversity influence scholarship potential for business school applicants?
How does it influence scholarship potential? I think schools, because they want to have a very diverse program and they want to have a very diverse student body, one of the ways to do that is obviously to incentivize a different, have difference come into their program. So incentivizing them through the scholarships and merit scholarships, and sometimes need-based scholarships as well. For our fellows, at least when the way I'm coaching my fellows, is not to build an application to receive a scholarship, but to build an application that is the most competitive application you can for admission to business school. And oftentimes those applications, and fortunate for us, we have great fellows that are in our program. Fortunate for us is they build very competitive applications that also will come with some level of scholarship as well. When I was, again, back in my former life in between, Wake Forest and Northwestern, it wasn't so much that we had to do this just to bring in candidates, but we wanted to make sure that we brought in the best students. And so scholarships were outside of just our underrepresented minority candidates. We offer scholarships to all great candidates, right? And so that's the goal, is to build your application to be as competitive as anyone, so that when the business schools see your application, they want to have you. And so then you are going to be part of this pool of merit money that incentivizes great applicants to come to that school, or great admits at this point, if they admit you, to come to their school and matriculate there.
Thanks, Lance. I wanted to ask you a little bit more of a follow-up, because it's a tough question, diversity, and it can be sensitive at times. And so we're dealing with people from all over the world. This is not just the States. And I know what your organization, I believe, is just dealing with Americans. And you have sometimes people who are coming from a background, at least that they perceive, is maybe an overrepresented population. Most famously in the MBA world, Indian male engineers, and they're very much in competition with each other. But that also makes me think of perhaps just white males in the US, also overrepresented. And then by extension, was thinking about your students and your fellows, I should say, who are now in competition with each other. So I kind of wanted to ask is, how do you go about supporting a candidate, an applicant, to develop their diverse profile or to express the intersectionality, if that's the word that they would use? Could be a variety of factors that are not just about race. So I'd love to hear what your process is and what you have to say.
I'm happy to start, and then I would love Lance to jump in as well. But in our program, we spend at least the first 2 to 3 months, I would say, doing quite a bit of personal introspection work and using various frameworks to help our fellows start to begin to really understand the path that they've walked so far and how that path may or should or hopefully does connect to where it is they hope to go in the future. And what we encounter often in our space are fellows who have worked very hard as they're very successful. These are people, as are the ones who work with you all, who have found a modicum of success so far. They've gone to a good undergrad. They've done well enough to consider grad school. They have a career that is flourishing in some kind of way. And they've decided they want even more from it. In our program, we often find folks who very intentionally separated parts of their identity out from their professional identity. And the MBA is very much a professional endeavor. This is the next move to accelerate my career trajectory. And what we're saying to them is, yes, and we want you to go back and start pick up some of those other pieces you've potentially left behind and start talking to us about them. And not only that, but these might actually be applicable in your MBA storytelling. And that in and of itself can be a huge hurdle, just an internal hurdle. And this isn't for everyone, but this is something we see sometimes. And is probably true outside of our program as well, of like, why would people care about my upbringing? Why would they care about how much I love to play baseball until I got injured freshman year in college? Why do they care? What does that have to do with me wanting to be in real estate or marketing? And us just sort of doing the work of expanding that open and saying, because this type of graduate school, they care about how you became who you are. And they actually think you playing baseball until you got injured is potentially indicative of your character in some way and would love to know that about you. And that can be really, really challenging is to get them to open up and to bring all of that into the conversation. But it's something that I think we all try to do, because schools care about having not just really smart people who will thrive academically, but people interested in different sports, people interested in different hobbies, people interested in all different kinds of things to build the community of their class, in addition to just the academic classroom.
Yeah, people who are going to contribute in so many diverse ways to the conversation in the classroom, but just to the campus culture in general. It's what makes it attractive as a school, but multidimensional. I always say we're here as professionals, but we're also human, and it's the human side that connects us. It is the human side that's going to get you an interview and perhaps hired, because when all things are equal, you have two CVs or resumes, as the Americans say, that are pretty much identical. If you connect with the person, which is why that personal interest in the bottom is really interesting, is why certain elements about your about section or even that cover pic on your LinkedIn that give a little bit more color and three-dimensionality to your profile than just a 2D piece of paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So many of our fellows have their long-term goal is tied up into who they are and their experiences. And so sometimes, we start out and we learn, okay, here's where you are professionally today. Here's where you want to be short term. Here's what you want to do long term. Where does that come from? And so back to Shannon's point and your point, Eric, is if we can tap into that, and now it makes your application more unique, because I often would get the question, well, how do I separate myself from the, other consultants who are applying to business school? And I said, well, you have to tell us who you are. And if I know more about who you are, then then you're more than just a consultant that's applying to the school. Now I understand who you are. And so again, those long-term goals for many of our fellows are wrapped up in some experience that they have had growing up. And so being able to tap into that, share that, becomes super important. And it makes that application more compelling to the business school to say, this is a person that I want because they have a vision that has been part of who they are for a long time. They're looking to solve a problem that typically they may have faced themselves. So it's pretty important for sure.
You said something really interesting that I think it's very true, that very often candidates are in the long-term goal looking to come back to their origins.
Mm-hmm.
Very often I see people coming from countries that maybe that don't offer top-level MBAs, and their short-term goal is to do a degree in these countries, to have a great career, to earn a lot of money, to first of all repay their loans, because almost everyone's got some kind of borrowing situation, and develop experience, make contacts, and so forth. In the medium term, maybe a pivot to higher management, maybe something in consulting, like on their own, opening up their own thing. But usually in the long term, very often I find their story links back to where they came from. They want to give back, or it's maybe just they want to be where they come from, or maybe it's about being near their parents who might be getting older at that point if they're like looking into the long term. So it's very important, that kind of origin story and what is fundamental and formative, that the business school can understand your long-term goals best and how all the dots connect.
I'm really struck by how the both of you are so, like, the excitement that you want to see in the students and the fellows that you're working with, you have it in the work that you're doing with them, and so I suspect that's really mirrored, for the students to see that the work you're doing and modeling the leadership that you're really hoping that they're going to embrace. And I'm curious, in that vein, have there been surprises that you've had with the diversity and the B School fellows that you're working with? Things, I don't know if that might be a challenging question, but any sort of surprises along the way that you changed because of these surprises?
I can start. So for me, it's a great opportunity to kind of practice some of the things that I preach when I am talking about equity and inclusion. So there is certainly some identity dynamics that play out in every relationship, right? So for sure, in this coaching relationship, there are some dynamics that play out, right? I'm the coach, they're the fellow. So there is some power dynamic that is part of that. I coach lots of women, right? So I am a man. I self-identify as a man. I self-identify as heterosexual. I coach members of the LGBTQ plus community. And so early on in the coaching relationship, I kind of bring some of those things up early to say, if there's a disconnect, if we're not aligned on something, it could have something to do with the identities that we own. And so we should name that. And you should help me. You should help coach me on things that I need to know. There's an age, I didn't mention the age. The age is the bigger one, right? There's an age difference for sure with me and my fellows that I coach. And so be open to having that conversation with me. And I have been pleasantly surprised that many of my fellows have been able to do that. And I think it has made me a better coach. I think it has made me a better practitioner when I am out facilitating equity and inclusion workshops. So that's something that I think coming in, I didn't plan on it happening, but I've certainly kind of grown, as a person from working with my fellows for the last few years.
The age one's a moving target, right?
Yes, it is. It certainly is.
I mean, I'll be really transparent and tell you that we have a conversation at some point almost every year when we have our kickoff seminar. Our program begins, and very shortly thereafter, we gather as a class for the first time. We're all physically together. And we'll acknowledge out loud, yeah, you're not crazy. We got a lot of white coaches on this team. And because we know that fellows are sort of talking about it, and that in some cases it can be a hurdle for a fellow to overcome. In other cases, they're like, oh, I didn't even think about that. But we say it out loud because you may, as a fellow, come into MLT thinking that everybody on the coaching team is going to be a person of color, and that is not the case on our coaching team. It's the case with some of our coaches and not with others. And so we say it out loud and say, if you want to talk about this with your coach, do it. Like, we're putting this on the table so that we can talk about this, to Lance's point, as one of the dynamics in place here. There are others as well. We have intersectional identities that Lance pointed out that can also factor into our relationships in coaching with our fellows. One of the things, though, and so that may be a surprise to them to see me stand up on this stage and say, yeah, you're right. There's a bunch of white people. There's a few white people in this room, and they're here on purpose, and they're here with a mission, and they're very much here intentionally. It also gives us space, and me as a program director specifically, to talk about allyship and how we have intersectional identities represented in the program. And we can look around and make assumptions about the racial identities of everyone here. I will tell you, there's a lot of visible diversity in the room when you bring an entire MBA prep class in. People look a lot different from each other as well, but you can make those assumptions, but there's a lot you don't know about the person sitting next to you. And so we don't just want our fellows to understand that they're coming into a diversity organization to strengthen the position of the groups they self-identify with, but also to become allies to those around them who may be underrepresented in other ways. And that we try, that we're modeling that in our program, as well as expecting them to take on that role as leaders in their organizations. The surprising thing to me, I think, earlier in my years at MLT, was hearing our alumni answer that question for new fellows. Am I going to be okay working with this coach? The responses that our alums will give make me emotional, to be honest, talking about the people who work in this organization and why everyone, regardless of their self-identity, has chosen intentionally to be at MLT. That has been a really moving surprise for me. But we haven't talked yet about allyship here. And I think allyship is a really, really important action-oriented word for anyone coming into an MBA program now to really consider actively embodying as a community member.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, there are plenty of applicants who they're struggling with the diversity question that you see on some MBA applications for a lot of top schools. Like, how do I answer this? I don't feel like I can embody diversity in some way. This is like the typical white male, etc. But allyship is the way. And I guess in a parallel to tokenism, going beyond just saying, oh yeah, I have a black friend, for example, like talk about being specifically anti-racist and like steps you've taken, like actions you've taken, conversations you've had to push that. And Shannon, you were speaking about visible diversity, and I think this is a great way to kind of bring it home because we do have to wrap up in a moment. Coming back to Barra's example of that exercise that I think we've all done it, right? Like someone reads a list of different traits, like, oh, you identify as Jewish or LGBT or whatever. You've been in a home with domestic violence, all these different aspects of diversity that are not, it's not just about race. And what does that mean? Not judging a book by its cover, first of all. As a coach, maybe you present as just white, but there's often a lot more going on there. Also, as someone who's an admissions consultant and coach, I know it is very much about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It's very much about empathy, and to your point in the beginning, Lance, about that kind of empathy training with a lot of introspection and reflection as a starting point before you can go work with the outside. But also, it's important to weigh in on, I think, the difference between aspects of diversity that are visible, which are not, because also how you present is often how you're treated. So that is a reality as well. Guys, I want to thank you for this really interesting discussion. This was great. Shannon, Lance, lots of wonderful insights. I think a lot of helpful insight for our audience. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, Barra. MBA hopefuls, if you liked today's episode, please give us a little thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Hit that little bell too to be notified every time we come up with a new episode. And for upcoming episodes, check out mbawaves.com. See you same time, same place, and have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.